The corner office on the 14th floor of Meridian Health Supplies looked out over Halifax Harbor on a morning the color of wet slate. Catherine Drummond stood with her back to the window, arms crossed, the sleeves of her navy blazer pushed to the elbows. She had been awake since 4:45. She had reviewed the file 3 times. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I want you to understand that this is not a conversation. The decision has been made." Thomas Callahan stood in the center of the room, 41 years old, a man built like someone who had spent years carrying things that were not his to carry, dark gray Henley. Shoulders that stayed square even when the rest of him wanted to fold. He did not argue. He did not ask her to reconsider. He looked at her for exactly the time it takes to memorize a face, and then he nodded once, turned, and walked out. The door pulled shut behind him. Catherine stood very still. Outside, a container ship moved through the outer harbor in the fog. She watched it until it disappeared, and then she looked at the file on her desk, and then she looked at the door, and then she looked at nothing. To understand why Thomas Callahan did not say a single word in his own defense, you have to go back 11 hours. At 6:30 the previous evening, the kitchen of a 2-bedroom house on Agricola Street in the north end of Halifax smelled like tomato soup and dish soap and the particular warmth of a house that is small enough that the oven heats the whole main floor. Thomas stood at the counter cutting bread. His daughter Rosalind was 7. She sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas, the ones with the small hedgehogs, her feet not quite reaching the floor. She had been quiet since dinner started, because, after 3 years of doing this alone, he could read her silences the way other people read weather. "What's going on in there?" Rosalind looked at her soup. "Mrs. Arsenault asked us to draw our family today." He set the bread knife down. "And I drew you and me," she said. "And then I had to explain why there were only 2 people and everyone else had 4 or 5. Thomas dried his hands on a dish towel and came to sit across from her. He did not try to fill the silence with something cheerful. He had learned that much. He waited. "I told them Mum is in heaven," Rosalind said, "and Jacob Mewes said heaven isn't real. What did you say back?" She looked up. There was something very old in her eyes for a 7-year-old. "I said I wasn't asking him." Thomas reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did not say anything for a moment. "There's a dads and kids breakfast at school tomorrow morning," Rosalind said. 7:30. He had a mandatory operations briefing at 8 o'clock. He had already received 2 written reminders from the office of the COO, a man named Garrett Fisk, who wore his suits 2 sizes too small and smiled the way people smile when they are calculating something. Thomas had not missed a single briefing in 3 years. He had not been late to work once. "I will be there," he said. Rosalind nodded once, very seriously, and picked up her spoon. At 7:30 the next morning, the gymnasium of Citadel Heights Elementary was loud with the sound of orange juice cartons and men who did not know where to put their hands. Thomas sat across from Rosalind at a table with a paper tablecloth, splitting a blueberry muffin. She introduced him to her friends with the gravity of a diplomat. "This is my dad. His name is Thomas. He knows how to fix bikes. He made French toast once with maple syrup from a real tree. He had planned to leave at 8:05. At 8:15, Rosalind was still holding his hand under the table. He stayed. At 8:40, kissed her on the top of her head, shook hands with 4 fathers he had just met, and walked out into the October cold to his truck. 11 floors up, in the boardroom of Meridian Health Supplies on Barrington Street, Garrett Fisk was already at the table when Catherine arrived. He had a manila folder open in front of him, and the particular expression of a man who had been rehearsing what he was about to say. Slid the folder across to her without preamble. "Callahan," he said, 3 late arrivals in the past 6 weeks, including this morning. I have documented each one. The team is watching how you handle accountability issues, Catherine, especially given the Simcoe contract review." He did not look at her when he said the last sentence. 3 other people at the table did. Catherine looked at the folder. The numbers were there. The signature at the bottom was Fisk's. "I will speak with him," she said. She did not say anything else. Thomas arrived at 9:52. He nodded to the woman at the front desk, took the elevator to the 9th floor, and sat down at his workstation. "Ms. Drummond would like to see you when you have a moment." He read it twice. He opened the top drawer of his desk and took out a photograph of Rosalind. Her school picture from last spring, gap-toothed smile, a yellow headband she had picked herself, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he went upstairs. She dismissed him in under 4 minutes. He packed his desk in 7, a transit map he had taped to the corkboard, a thermos he kept meaning to take home, the photograph of Rosalind, a folding multi-tool from the bottom drawer that had fixed 3 separate things in the office kitchen, and 2 more in the parking garage over the past 2 years. No one had ever asked whose it was. He tucked it into his coat pocket. The security escort was a young man named Dale, 24 years old, new in November. He looked like he wanted to apologize and didn't know if that was permitted. "It's okay, Dale," Thomas said. "Do the job." On the main floor, an older woman named Ruth Nakamura stood near the elevator bank. She was 63, 15 years in accounts receivable, and she was holding a coffee mug she had not yet drunk from. She had not been on this floor 20 minutes ago. When Thomas passed, she straightened her posture by half an inch. Her eyes followed him to the door. He did not look back. He sat in his truck in the parking structure on Granville Street for an hour. He took a napkin from the glove box and wrote down 3 numbers. 9,000 in savings, 4 months of mortgage, Rosalind's swimming lessons through December. He folded it, put it in his wallet, and drove to Point Pleasant Park. He sat on a bench near the water. The Atlantic was dark and indifferent and very beautiful. He stayed for 2 hours. He did not cry. He had finished his crying in the particular way you finish crying, after you have been sitting in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning and a doctor has come out and the way she walked told you everything before she opened her mouth. That kind of crying leaves a different kind of quiet behind. He had been living in that quiet for 3 years. He called his neighbor, an older Acadian woman named Marguerite Thibodeau, who had a key to his house and an opinion about everything, and who had been feeding Rosalind after school since the autumn his wife died, and asked if she could take Rosalind for the night. He said he had some paperwork at the office. He didn't have an office anymore. At 1:15, Garrett Fisk appeared in Catherine's doorway, hands in his pockets, looking the way people look when they have done something they intend to call a favor. "Board will be watching the Simcoe decision closely," he said. "This helps." Catherine nodded without looking up from her monitor. That evening she drove to a working dinner in Dartmouth. 3 senior partners, a white tablecloth, and halibut that had been reduced to a texture it was never meant to have. By 7:30 the rain was coming in from the south, the kind of October rain off the water that does not fall so much as arrive. She drove the Mackay Bridge alone, the wipers working hard. At 7:54 the check engine light came on. The engine ran rough for 30 seconds and stopped. She coasted onto the shoulder of Windmill Road under a streetlight that had been out since August. She tried the ignition 4 times. Nothing. She stepped out. Roadside assistance. Minimum 90 minutes. Her phone said 11% battery. She walked to the front of the car and stood in the rain with her hand up at the headlights coming south. A gray sedan, a van with a company logo, a pickup pulling a boat, a family SUV with a dog in the back window, a transport truck that parted the puddles at her feet. She counted 19 vehicles. The shoulders of her blazer had soaked through. Her heels had gone into the gravel an inch on each side. She was, for the first time in a very long time, invisible. At 8:09, a black pickup slowed from the north. It pulled onto the shoulder 40 feet ahead and stopped. The driver's door opened. The man who got out wore a dark gray Henley and moved through the rain without hurrying. The headlights behind him caught his shape before they caught his face. She recognized the shape, then the face. Neither of them moved. 3 seconds on the shoulder of Windmill Road, long enough to be sure, long enough to wish it were otherwise. She was the one who could not speak. He walked toward her, same even pace. The walk of a man who has been somewhere worse than this on a night worse than this. He stopped 10 steps away. "How long has it been off?" "About 25 minutes. Her voice was steadier than she deserved. He nodded once. He walked around to the front of her car and she stepped back to give him room. He propped the hood and stood under it for 90 seconds with his phone light. Not hers. His. "Fuel pump," he said. "Not a roadside fix." He straightened and looked down the road. "I can drive you back to the city. There's no rideshare on this stretch, I know, because I tried once. I don't want to take you out of your way." He shrugged off the canvas work jacket he was wearing over the Henley and held it out to her without comment. She looked at it. "You're soaked through," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the traffic in the opposite lane, the same way a man looks at a horizon when he is giving someone else privacy to make a choice. She took the jacket. It was warm. It smelled like motor oil and something like sawdust, and very faintly like a particular kind of autumn that belongs to people who spend time outside for reasons other than recreation. She climbed into the rear passenger seat. The front passenger seat held a small person, 7 years old. Cheeks slightly flushed, a dinosaur blanket pulled to her chin, her head tipped against the window, eyes closed, a half-finished juice box balanced in her sleeping hand. On her lap was a folded piece of yellow construction paper, 3 figures drawn in crayon. A tall person with dark hair, a smaller person with a yellow headband, and a third figure slightly apart from the other two, drawn in lighters. Maybe the crayon had been pressing less hard on purpose. "This is Rosalind," Thomas said as he pulled back onto the road. "She's a little warm. I got her from Mrs. Thibodeau's about an hour ago." Catherine looked at the sleeping child through the gap between the seats, at the juice box balanced so carefully in the small sleeping hand. "This child should be at the neighbor's right now. If I had not," she stopped the thought. She turned and looked at the window. For 22 minutes Thomas drove south along Windmill, across the bridge, into the city. 4 kilometers under the limit, no sharp stops, the radio off, just the rain on the glass and the rhythm of the wipers. Catherine sat with the collar of the work jacket held up near her face. She was not sure when she had last worn a coat that smelled like anything at all. In her closet at home there were 4 wool blazers and a down parka and a rain jacket that was really a brand, and none of them smelled like anything except dry cleaning solvent. She owned nothing that had been worn long enough to absorb a life. She sat with that thought until it became too large to hold. At 8:41 he stopped the truck on the corner of Spring Garden Road outside her building. He left the engine running. Rosalind had not stirred. Catherine opened the door and reached back to remove the jacket. "Keep it for now," he said. He was looking straight ahead through the windshield. "It's October. Return it whenever." He said the last part without realizing what he had assumed, that there would be a whenever. She stood on the stone steps of her building in the rain and held the jacket against her side and watched the black pickup until it turned left on Roby Street and disappeared. She did not go inside. She stood on those steps for a long time. The rain fell on the navy blazer she had worn to fire a man that morning, and she stood in it and did not move. She was not yet aware that when she arrived at the office the next morning, everything she thought she knew about Thomas Callahan would come apart. She did not sleep. She was in the elevator at 5:55. The Meridian Health Supplies Board held quarterly sessions. The first member to arrive that morning was a retired Rear Admiral named James Okafor, who had been on the board since 2006. He was 68 years old, white hair cut close, the kind of posture that a body carries long after the uniform is retired. He stepped off the elevator and stopped at the staff update screen near reception. It cycled through the overnight notices. Near the end, contract terminated, Thomas Callahan, Senior Logistics Coordinator. Admiral Okafor stood in front of that screen for 11 seconds. He turned to the receptionist. "Does Ms. Drummond know who that man is?" The receptionist blinked. "I'm sorry, sir. That will be the answer," he said. "Please tell her I need 10 minutes before the board convenes. In private." 6 kilometers away, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee he had made and forgotten. Rosalind was at her desk by the window with her drawing pad. She did not know yet. He had decided to tell her after school. He just hadn't worked out the words. 20 minutes later, in the office where she had dismissed him the previous morning, Catherine sat across from Admiral James Okafor. He had not taken coffee. He sat with his hands folded over one knee like a man who had learned that stillness was a form of authority. "Ms. Drummond, the man on your termination notice this morning. Warrant Officer 2nd Class Thomas Callahan, Canadian Armed Forces, Supply Chain and Logistics. I served alongside his commanding officer during the Kandahar rotation. Callahan was field decorated for maintaining uninterrupted medical supply chains to 3 forward operating bases during a 17-day communications blackout. Not one clinic ran out of critical supplies, not one. He left the service early because his wife was diagnosed. He wanted to come home before it was too late. He made it by 9 days. Catherine's mouth opened. She did not say anything. "I understand you had documentation," the Admiral said. "May I see it?" She slid the folder across the touch. Garrett Fisk's signature at the bottom. He looked at it without touching it. He looked for a long time. "Before this meeting begins," he said, "I would encourage you to pull the raw attendance data yourself. Not the summary, not the COO's version, the raw system records." He stood and buttoned his jacket. At the door he paused. "Your father built this company by trusting what he observed directly. I would suggest that you trust what you observed last night." He left. Catherine sat very still in the empty office. "What you observed last night." She picked up her phone. "Get me Ruth Nakamura from accounts receivable, and I need the unfiltered attendance logs for Thomas Callahan from IT, not the HR summary, the raw data." Ruth arrived 8 minutes later. She was 63 with the careful stillness of someone who had spent 15 years watching everything and had learned to keep records of the things no one asked her to record. She set a plain manila envelope on the desk. "I have been holding this," Ruth said, "since June." The data was unambiguous. For 6 weeks, Thomas Callahan had badged in at an average of 7:53 in the morning. Never once after 8:08, except for the morning Catherine had dismissed him, 9:52. 3 late arrivals, Fisk's summary had stated. The raw system log showed exactly 1. Catherine pulled the access history on the attendance database. Garrett Fisk had logged into it 11 times in the past 6 weeks, each access within 18 hours of submitting a summary report to her office. She stood up and walked to the window. 8 floors below, the loading dock was running. She watched a man in a safety vest direct a transport trailer backward toward the bay with 2 hand signals and no wasted motion. In a kitchen on Agricola Street, Thomas was heating tomato soup for the 2nd night in a row and watching Rosalind draw at her small desk. She was drawing the 3 figures again, the tall one, the small one with the yellow headband, and the one with lighter crayon lines. He had not asked her in 3 years why she kept drawing that 3rd figure. He set a bowl of soup in front of her and kissed the top of her head. He had picked up the phone twice to call his former commanding officer about a contract role in Moncton, and twice he had set it back down because Rosalind had walked in. In her office, Catherine opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside was the envelope with Thomas Callahan's termination letter and his final check. She had signed both the previous afternoon. She had not sent either. She held the envelope for a long time. Then she put it back in the drawer. Ruth Nakamura was still standing in the room, watching her with the particular patience of a woman who had seen a great many things come around. "How long have you known?" Catherine asked. Ruth folded her hands. "About the altered records? Since late summer. I didn't know for certain who had done it. But your father once told me when I was new and had made a genuine error in payroll that the difference between a trustworthy company and a corrupt one is whether the truth can still be found. I decided to keep the truth findable." Catherine nodded slowly. "I owe him an apology." "You owe several people several things," Ruth said. "But yes, him first." She left. Catherine did not go home that evening. She sat at her desk with the office lights dim and the rain starting again outside, and the envelope still in the drawer. She had believed she understood the situation. But there was one person in the building who had been keeping evidence since before she had arrived, for no reason other than that he had learned to. Bill Huang knocked on her door at 6:40 the following morning. He was the senior receiving clerk, 61 years old, a man whose hands showed 30 years of moving things carefully. He held a small hardcover notebook, black cover, the kind sold in bulk at the office supply store downtown, and the corners had gone soft from years in a coat pocket. He laid it on her desk and opened it. Each line was a date, a time, a weather notation, written in a small consistent hand. October 3rd, 7:51, fog. October 48, clear. October 5th, 7:53, rain. Page after page without a gap. "Callahan's arrival times at the loading bay," Bill said. "I have kept a log on every senior coordinator since 2011. I started doing it because someone once told me that a supervisor who arrives before his team makes the whole operation arrive on time." He paused. "Callahan told me that, first month he was here." Catherine looked up. "I've known who he was since his 2nd week," Bill said. "He didn't mention it. I recognized the operation he'd been part of from a contracting report I'd filed years back. When I brought it up, he asked me not to make it a thing. He said it had no bearing on the work." He turned to a tabbed page near the back. "These 4 dates that appear in Mr. Fisk's summary as late arrivals. 3 of them, Callahan worked the overnight receiving shift because we were short-staffed, and I had a knee that was bad that week. He came in at 5 in the morning and stayed through the morning audit. He didn't leave the building for 27 hours. The 4th date, he had a medical appointment for his daughter that I knew about because he'd arranged coverage 2 weeks in advance. Mr. Fisk marked all 4 as unexcused tardiness." He closed the notebook and set it gently on her desk. "I have been ready to give that account for as long as there was someone to give it to. I just needed someone to ask." He turned at the door. "Ms. Drummond, one more thing. Callahan never mentioned his wife once, in 3 years. I learned about her from the photograph he kept on his desk. His daughter is wearing the same style of bracelet in the photo as the woman in the picture beside her. The kind you get made in pairs. He saw me notice one day. He didn't say anything, he just nodded and went back to work. That was the only conversation we've ever had that wasn't about the receiving schedule. He let himself out. Catherine sat for a long time. By 9 o'clock, the director had verified tax logs, 11 entries, all Fisk's account, all within 18 hours of his summary submissions. By 10:30, the legal team had found what Ruth had suspected and never been asked to confirm. Garrett Fisk held a 14% stake in a third-party logistics firm currently shortlisted to take over Meridian's Atlantic supply contract, a stake he had not disclosed in 14 months of board filings. At 11, Catherine took her phone to the window. She dialed the number from his employee file. He answered on the second ring. "Callahan, Thomas. It's Catherine Drummond." A pause. "I would like to come by your house this afternoon. There are things I need to say to you in person, if that's all right." 3 seconds. Not hesitation, the silence of a person who thinks before they speak. "Rosalind gets home at 3:30, he said, and then he hung up. Catherine held the phone for a moment after the line went quiet, and then she sat down on the edge of her desk. And for the first time since she had taken over this company from her father's estate, she allowed herself to stop performing and just sit there, and the feeling that moved through her was something she could not name yet, but it was not unpleasant. At 3:45, she stood on the small porch of a house on Agricola Street holding a brown envelope. Inside, a reinstatement letter with an upgraded title, a handwritten apology on plain stationery, and the legal team's preliminary report on Garrett Fisk. The door opened before she could knock. Rosalind stood in the doorway in a sweatshirt that said Nova Scotia Strong and looked at Catherine with her mother's eyes, or at least with the directness of a child who has learned that the world will not wait for her to feel ready. "You were in the rain," Rosalind said. Catherine blinked. "You were in Dad's truck. I wasn't all the way asleep." Rosalind stepped back and held the door open. "You should come in, it's cold." The house was small and warm and exactly tidy in the way that houses are tidy when one adult is working very hard to hold everything together. A coat rack with 2 coats and 1 small yellow rain jacket. A kitchen table with 2 chairs and a third chair pulled slightly back, as if it was used sometimes but not always. On the fridge, held by vegetable magnets, carrots, broccoli, a smiling corn were drawings in a careful grid. Rosalind's work, probably 40 of them. Most of them showed 3 figures, a tall one, a small one with a yellow headband, and one drawn in lighter lines. The newest drawing was taped to the center of the freezer door. 2 figures under a maple tree, their shoulders almost but not quite touching. Thomas came in from the kitchen drying a dish. He looked at her without surprise. He folded the dish towel over his shoulder. "Mrs. Drummond." "Catherine." He gestured at the kitchen table. She sat. Rosalind sat on the floor with her drawing pad, opened it without ceremony, and began coloring. Catherine placed the envelope on the table. "The records were falsified," she said. "Fisk was accessing the database directly and editing your entries. He also failed to disclose a financial interest in the firm currently bidding on our Atlantic contract. I have a board session Thursday morning. He doesn't know yet that I know." She pushed the envelope across the table. Thomas did not pick it up. "I came here," she continued, and her voice was steady, "not because the board will expect me to remedy this. Not because Admiral Okafor is watching. I came because you deserve to hear it from me in your home face to face, without it being managed." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "I'll make tea," he said. He went to the kitchen. Rosalind looked up from her drawing pad. She patted the carpet beside her. Catherine Drummond, who had attended a G7 trade delegation dinner in Ottawa and once sat 6 seats from the Prime Minister at a Halifax waterfront gala, took off her shoes and sat down on the floor of a small house on Agricola Street. Rosalind showed her each drawing in order. The tall figure was Daddy. The smaller figure was Rosalind. The one with the lighter crayon lines was Mummy, who lived in heaven and who had the same brown hair as Rosalind except longer, and who used to call Rosalind my little peanut, which was how Daddy knew to call her that too. Rosalind had been drawing all 3 of them every day for 3 years. "But I stopped drawing the third one last month," Rosalind said, considering this with the gravity of a person delivering a report. "Because Daddy gets sad when he looks at them. And I don't want him to be sad." Catherine's throat tightened. "But she's still real," Rosalind said. "Very matter of fact. She's just not here." From the kitchen came the sound of a kettle and the small ceramic knock of mugs being set down. Thomas came back and stood in the doorway with 2 cups of tea and his shoulder against the frame, watching them on the floor. He did not move for a moment. He stood there with the 2 cups and watched his daughter show a near stranger her drawings with the same complete trust she gave to everything. Then he set 1 cup on the table beside the envelope he still had not opened, and he sat down on the floor next to his daughter. The 3 of them stayed there until the tea was cold. When Rosalind fell asleep on the carpet with her cheek on her drawing pad, Thomas carried her down the hall to her room without a sound. Catherine heard him pull a blanket up, heard the small click of a nightlight. He came back and stood in the doorway, looking at her sitting on the floor with the empty cups. "You didn't have to come in person," he said. "I would have read the letter." "I know," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. The boardroom at Meridian Health Supplies held 8 people on Thursday morning. Garrett Fisk sat to Catherine's left in a fresh suit, the particular relaxed confidence of a man who does not know the room has already shifted. He smiled at her when she sat down. She did not smile back. "Before we move to the Simcoe contract review," Catherine said, "there is a disclosure and personnel matter I need to bring forward." She nodded to the projector. The first slide, raw attendance data, 6 weeks sorted by day. The second slide, system access log, 11 entries all from 1 account. The third slide, the account holder's name. "This is fabricated," Fisk said. His voice was even. "Any administrator could have accessed that account." The fourth slide, a page from a small black hardcover notebook, handwritten dates and times in a careful small print. The fifth slide, a corporate filing, a Delaware-registered logistics company, 14% ownership, Garrett Allen Fisk, undisclosed for 14 months. "The notebook is anecdotal," Fisk said. He was not smiling now. "A dock worker's personal record has no standing." The door at the back of the room opened. Thomas Callahan entered first in a dark gray Henley. The same canvas jacket Catherine had returned to him an hour earlier folded over his arm. Behind him came Bill Huang in his receiving clerk vest, which he had pressed that morning. Behind Bill came Admiral James Okafor, who had told the room he was stepping out to take a call. The Admiral did not sit. He stood at the back of the room with his hands behind him. "Members of this board," he said, and his voice was quiet in the way that commands do not need to be loud. "Mr. William Huang has served the logistics and receiving operations of this company with documented accuracy for 31 years. His record in that capacity and his corroborating account of Warrant Officer Callahan's service record constitutes, in my assessment, a material and credible testimony. I will sign an affidavit to that effect before I leave this building." 2 board members on Fisk's left leaned away from him. The vote took 5 minutes, 7-1. The company's legal counsel walked to Fisk's chair and asked for his access badge. Fisk stood. He looked at Catherine. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He set the badge on the polished table and walked out. Ruth Nakamura was standing in the doorway as he passed. She did not look at him. She walked into the room and placed a complete personnel file on the table in front of Catherine. Every page she had quietly kept for 6 months, all of it recoverable, all of it true. Thomas had remained standing at the back wall through the entire proceeding, hands clasped behind him, weight even. He did not look satisfied. He did not look like anything that required a name. When the room had cleared, he looked at Catherine across the empty table. She looked back. She nodded once. He nodded back. No one still in the room saw it. They were gathering their folders. The 2 of them stood still for 3 seconds. The same 3 seconds that had been accumulating since the morning he had walked out of her office without a word. The snow came to Halifax in early December, the wet, heavy kind that bends the older trees. Thomas was reinstated as Director of Logistics Operations, a position that did not previously exist and that Catherine had written the scope for on a Saturday afternoon at her kitchen table. He kept driving the same truck. He kept eating lunch in the break room on the receiving floor with the dock crew. Bill Huang's notebook sat in a glass case in the lobby of the Barrington Street office now, with a small engraved plaque. Catherine had ordered it without consulting anyone. In the first week of December, Rosalind had her class art show at the Needham Community Center on Gottingen Street. The show was for the 2nd grade enrichment program. 14 drawings hung on the gym wall. 3 of them were Rosalind's. She had addressed the invitation herself. She had used the printer at her school library. She had written Catherine Drummond, Meridian Health Supplies, "Please don't tell Dad" at the bottom in pencil, the letters very careful and very small. Catherine arrived 12 minutes early. She wore the camel-colored blazer from the night on Windmill Road, dry cleaned, the cuff buttons replaced. Thomas saw her across the gymnasium. He did not look surprised. He never looked surprised. His face did the thing it did. A small, voluntary stillness, like a man who has received news he was half expecting and has decided to meet it without performance. He nodded at her from across the room. He did not come over. Rosalind did. She took Catherine's hand and led her to the wall without negotiation. Two of the drawings were a house and a harbor scene. The third was new, 3 figures under a maple tree, a tall one, a small one with a yellow headband, and a woman with brown hair standing just beside them, her hand reaching toward the small one's hand, not quite touching, almost. Rosalind did not explain it. Catherine did not ask. After they walked along the waterfront, Thomas kept his hands in his pockets. The harbor was the color of pewter and perfectly flat. They walked for 35 minutes and spoke perhaps 9 sentences, most of them about the weather and whether the boats would come out again before spring. At one point, Rosalind ran ahead toward a cluster of pigeons near a bench, convinced she had spotted something extraordinary among them. Thomas knelt in the cold when she came back with her empty hands cupped together and admired what was not there with all the patience of a man who has chosen, very deliberately, to be present. Catherine watched him do it. Near the water's edge, he said, half to himself and half to the harbor. Miriam liked the snow when it came off the water. Then he did not say anything else for a long time, and Catherine did not ask him anything. And the only sound was their steps on the boardwalk and the pigeons in the cold water moving. At the end, near the parking lot, Catherine took the canvas jacket from her bag, washed and folded. Thomas looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. He put it back in her hands. "Keep it, Catherine. December in Halifax is not a month for blazers." She did not argue. Rosalind ran past them toward the truck, calling back something about hot chocolate and whether or not it counted as dinner. Thomas watched her go. He turned back. For a moment he almost said something. He didn't. He nodded once. The same nod she had first seen in her office, the morning everything had started, and then he followed his daughter. Catherine stood on the waterfront with the jacket over her arm, until the truck's taillights disappeared around the corner of Lower Water Street. The harbor stayed flat and gray and cold. She did not move for a long time. By February, the ice had come and gone from the harbor once already, and the maple trees along Agricola Street were showing the first pale swelling of buds. Thomas had moved Rosalind into a slightly larger house on Jubilee Road, with a yard and a wooden fence he was repairing on Sunday afternoons, one section at a time. On the second Sunday in February, Catherine arrived at 1 o'clock with a small pot of rosemary on the passenger seat because Rosalind had texted her on Wednesday. Actually texted her from Thomas's phone, with his silent permission if not his explicit one, asking if she could bring something green to plant because the yard looked lonely. Catherine had spent an afternoon at the nursery in Dartmouth. She did not know anything about plants. She bought the sturdiest thing on the table and a small bag of potting soil and a pair of child-sized gardening gloves in yellow. Rosalind planted the rosemary in the corner by the south fence, patting the soil down with both palms the way people do when they want something to stay. Thomas watched them through the kitchen window as he dried the lunch dishes. In 6 months, no one had given what existed between them a name. There had been no declaration, no deliberate crossing of any line. Catherine came on Sundays. Sometimes she stayed for dinner. Once she had helped Rosalind write a story for school about a girl who discovers she can talk to horses. Once Thomas had come by her apartment on a Saturday to look at a door that had been sticking, and while he worked she had made pasta in his kitchen with ingredients she'd brought in a bag, and Rosalind had set 3 places at the table without being asked. Admiral Okafor had retired from the board in January. At his retirement dinner he had found a quiet moment to put a hand briefly on Catherine's arm. "Your father would recognize what you've built here," he said, "and what you're building." That afternoon, when Rosalind had finished with the soil, she stood up and tilted her head and looked at Catherine. "Are you staying for dinner?" Catherine looked toward the kitchen window. Thomas was standing inside with the dish towel over his shoulder. He met her eyes through the glass. He gave a small nod. She nodded back. That evening the 3 of them sat at the round kitchen table on Jubilee Road. Thomas sliced bread. Rosalind told an elaborate story about a boy in her class who had tried to smuggle a frog into school in his lunchbox and been discovered at precisely the worst moment. Catherine passed the butter without being asked to. There was a candle on the table. Thomas had not placed it there. Rosalind had found it in the cupboard and lit it before dinner because she said a table without a candle looked like it was waiting to start. The light was yellow and steady. At some point after the bread was finished, Rosalind climbed down from her chair and stood behind Catherine and asked, with complete matter-of-factness, if Catherine knew how to braid hair. Catherine said it had been a very long time. Rosalind turned around and waited. Catherine braided her hair. It was uneven. Rosalind checked her reflection in the dark window over the sink and declared it excellent and climbed back into her chair. Thomas sat across the table and watched, and his expression was the one he wore when he was not trying to have an expression, which was the most honest one he had. Nobody said the word love, nobody said the word family, nobody announced anything. Thomas poured Rosalind a second glass of water. Catherine reached for the salt. Rosalind laughed at something that had nothing to do with anything. In the corner of the yard, the rosemary sat in its dark soil and waited for spring. Neither of them had been looking for this. That was the only reason either of them trusted that it was real.